Today's speaker, as you know, which is why you're here, is Chris Hoff, who is an award-winning historian, researcher, and filmmaker. Chris graduated from the University of Delaware with a major in communications, emphasizing radio and TV, which he worked on during his college years. He has been an adjunct instructor, professor, whatever they call him these days, but both at Hood College in Frederick, and more recently at Frederick Community College in the ILR program, which is Institute for Learning and Retirement. It's a wonderful program. I've been in the Maryland room, in the history room in the library in Frederick when Chris has come through there with classes. It's a great program. In fact, my wife is interested in teaching there. And Chris has 2 courses, at least there, one of which covers the 1.2 billion years of prehistory of Frederick County. So if you have a little time, you might want to take that course. He has been the tourism, I don't know his formal title, but tourism marketing, destination marketing for Frederick County, in the course of which he's done a lot on the byways, the Hallowed Ground program, which of course extends into Loudoun, Heart of the Civil War, Maryland's Heart of the Civil War, Heritage Area, and a long list of other things which I won't go through. He worked for at least 17 years in cable TV, mostly in Maryland, but some in Virginia also. Produced for Frederick Town, the town's 250th anniversary, a 10-hour documentary on the history of Frederick. That was 1995, I believe. 1998, he did a 6-hour documentary which was called Up from the Meadows, the History of Black Americans in Frederick County, for which he got a local Emmy Award. Has also done the Maryland Heart of the Civil War Heritage Area film for them. And for the past 3 years, he's got a job that I envy, which is he's the History and Preservation Director at Mount Olivet Cemetery in Frederick. So he gets to spend full time going through cemeteries and writing stories about people who are buried there, which I do on a much smaller scale for some of the cemeteries here. But this is where Chris and I met, and we hit it off immediately, because it's a great thing to be able to do. So, welcome, Chris Hoff.
Well, thank you, Ed, and thanks to the Lovettsville Historical Society, and thanks to Loudoun County. About 6 weeks ago, I was invited to speak for the Luckett's Roritan, and we actually covered 1.2 billion years of prehistory. And I've got a few of my prehistory mentors in the room here today, too, so I thank you for coming up. But what you need? Oh, your pad here. So a range of topics, and today is one of my all-time favorite topics, and I'll get into that in a minute, but I have to sometimes get my mind straight. As Ed mentioned, I've been able to do some documentary work in the past, and I'm sometimes referred to as the poor man's Ken Burns of Frederick County, Maryland, which I love. I love that, because I was influenced by Ken Burns when I was in college there with, as a matter of fact, a documentary he did on radio called Empire of the Air. So this was even before the great Civil War documentary that we're all familiar with, and of course so many more that have come since then. But sometimes I have to kind of wrap my head around, because each day I'm working on a big project. It's the 80th anniversary of the United Way of Frederick, so I'm working on a big industrial history of that. The Civil War always seems to kind of creep up one way or another, or other wars. Right now, World War I, I'm doing a big project since it's the commemoration of the 100th anniversary of World War I, so I've got that in my brain. But one of the greatest things I'm able to do on a regular basis at the cemetery is each week I write a blog called Stories in Stone, and somewhat exactly what Ed does here. But I tackle somebody in the cemetery and try to well, I don't actually. I tackle the challenge of trying to find out I try to bring them back alive is what I try to do. But it's really been a neat challenge for me because I've had this opportunity to learn Frederick history, especially in its chronology. And it's not just Frederick, it's really this region because we have so many links. I mean, the river really didn't divide us that much. But just to kind of have that knowledge and to have worked with so many great historians and avocational historians and folks that had lived the history that were around before me, but to kind of have that tapestry there and then to be able to walk through a cemetery and you see a neat monument here or an interesting monument there, and really these are just names in stone that are carved in. You see a birth date, a death date, you might see a familiar Frederick centric name that you kids you went to school with, but you knew that their families, they're descended from families that came here in the 1740s, 1750s. But to really kind of try to find out who they were and what their contribution to the community was. And of course, all the stories end the same. The person died. But obviously, but it's really neat because I think when I was doing documentaries and when I was going to cemeteries, and if any of you are, and there's a term for it, tombstone tourist, where if you go into a community, you visit somewhere, whether it's New Orleans or Key West or wherever, and you know, you want to go on that self-guided tour of the cemetery because you can learn who were the movers and shakers of that town. How can you learn about the culture of that town, the families that were there, and also see the beautiful artwork, especially competing leaders of town who would have the grander grave monument. But this is all such a fascinating thing, and when I would walk through Mount Olivet Cemetery, my head would be on a swivel because I'm like, oh, that guy was a mayor back in the 1870s. Oh, this lady did this person had a store. But to really be able to do this on a regular basis and try to teach Frederick history along the way has been very rewarding. And you know, in this cemetery here, you know, our most famous person, our greeter at the front of the cemetery, is none other than Francis Scott Key. I know he's come under attack a little bit over the last year with the Star Spangled Banner and NFL and all that, but you couldn't have a better individual at that front gate. And one of the things I was able to do when I was with the Tourism Council and through the byways and Journey Through Hallowed Ground and all was to put more interpretation there. It's just amazing how many people just do the drive-through. One day I camped out, this a couple years ago, where we were writing the grants for the project, and to see license plates from all over the country pulling in there because it's something that, of course, binds us all. But a lot of people, who the heck was Francis Scott Key? Or, you know, why did he write this poem? Or is it a song? It's really a song. But to have that at our front gate is just a great welcome to the cemetery, but we have so many other stories. And I'm going to tell you about, today we're going to talk a little bit about our probably second most famous person in that cemetery, a lady named Barbara Fritchie. And here is her grave monument within the cemetery, and there is Barbara Fritchie, and we're so lucky to have a picture of a lady who lived through the Revolutionary War and was basically middle-aged during the War of 1812. But to have a photo of her, a lady in her 90s, this was taken around 1859, is an incredible thing. Now, maybe Barbara is not looking her best in this picture. I'm sure she was quite annoyed because her nephew was a famous, or her nephew-in-law was a famous photographer in town, and probably asked her to sit for it, and people weren't used to sitting for, especially people of her stature, to sit for this picture, and I'm sure she was just not thrilled about it, and you can kind of see that in her eyes when you look there. But we're so lucky to have this picture, and it's carved in relief at the top of the monument here. But over the years, people have been visiting this grave and her former grave in another cemetery to pay homage. One person was Alexander Graham Bell. Gave us a telephone. I found an account early 20th century where he and his wife spent a few minutes and recited the poem there at the monument. But Barbara Fritchie, how many people know who Barbara Fritchie is? I mean, I know you all were attracted to this. How many people have never heard of Barbara Fritchie before? Great, great. And if you were to poll people, especially people of a certain younger demographic age, nobody would have any clue who Barbara Fritchie was. But when I worked at the Visitor Center in Frederick, it was neat, where people from all over the country, there'd be people would come in and say, I know Barbara Fritchie, and they would start reciting the poem. And you would ask them, how? How do you know this? Up from the meadows, rich with corn, clear on a, they would start into this, or else they would say the famous line, shoot if you must this old gray head, but spare your country's flag, she said. And you would ask them, how do you know this? And they said, we learned it in grade school. Again, you're kind of like, wow, kudos to the teacher there. But more recently, Barbara Fritchie, younger folks would know Barbara Fritchie from a diner that unfortunately just closed a few months ago, but a diner on Route 40, the Barbara Fritchie Candy Stick Restaurant, which was on Route 40 there in Frederick. And more people thought, well, she was the lady who started that restaurant, right? Or she made Barbara Fritchie candy, right? That's why she's famous. But today, I'm not going to put the onus on Barbara Fritchie, because there was another woman who was the real Barbara Fritchie. Her name was Mary Quantrell. And as usually when I'm talking about Mary Quantrell, a hush comes over the room. People are like, I've never heard of her. And what are you saying about Barbara Fritchie? And I've had some people too come at me with, why are you tearing down Barbara Fritchie? And I have nothing but love and respect for Barbara Fritchie, because if it wasn't for Barbara Fritchie, Frederick County, Maryland, Frederick City wouldn't have the tourism it's had. I never would have had a job there. I wouldn't have been able to do half of the things I've been able to do. So thank you, Barbara. You put us on the map. She really did. She never knew that she did, but it was a poet named John Greenleaf Whittier from Amesbury, Massachusetts, whose poem in 1863 really opened up the doors to Frederick tourism and Frederick visitation for decades, centuries to come, because of the Ballad of Barbara Fritchie, which he wrote. But let's get into this. So I want to explain to you who Barbara Fritchie was first before I get into Mary Quantrell. So this was, and I'm going to say was past tense, this was Barbara's house, located on West Patrick Street in Frederick. How many people have been to Frederick? Okay, good. So on West Patrick Street, right by, and at the front of the picture, you can see a wooden bridge. This bridge goes over Carroll Creek, which is the main water, the town creek per se, through Frederick. And there is Barbara up in the corner again. But because of her popularity, we made sure an early picture was taken by that same nephew married to her niece that took her picture. But some little facts about Barbara. So Barbara was born in 1766. Her husband, John Casper Fritchie, was a glove maker. His father had migrated to Frederick, kind of that early German migration story that we have here in Lovettsville and Loudoun County as well. John's father, unfortunately, found himself was on the wrong side of the Revolutionary War. He was a Tory loyalist, and unfortunately got involved with a few other Germans there in a plot. And a spy heard about it, and these gentlemen went to trial. And John Fritchie, Barbara's husband, John Fritchie's father, was one of 3 men that were executed. So that didn't work out too well for him. At the same time, poor young John Fritchie had to kind of live with the shame that his old man was a traitor during the War for Independence. So it probably didn't make for the greatest upbringing. I'm sure they didn't have lockers in school then, but he probably would have been locked in it had he been. But it was a tough situation for him. Matter of fact, he said he didn't want the Fritchie name to live on, because he didn't want an offspring to have to endure the same humiliation and shame that he did. So boy, was he wrong. But he picked Barbara Fritchie as his wife, and Barbara was considerably older than him. So I guess good for Barbara. It kind of also makes her Frederick's first cougar, because she was a little pop culture there for you, because she was about 16 years older than him, and she would marry in her early 40s. But Barbara Fritchie at this point in time, another surprise is that she was a slaveholder. Had a few slaves, But as I said, that life that she led, that spanned the Revolutionary War to the War of 1812, and then 50 years later. So she probably walked or knew Francis Scott Key from him starting his law career there in Frederick. But 50 years later, we have the American Civil War. And she was said to have been this die-hard Unionist, and that would be expected as a German, but not a surprise if she did own slaves. It's not that some Germans didn't own slaves, they did. But she lived at this point in her 90s. Her husband had passed, but in the early 1860s, she was living with a niece, Harriet Yoner. And supposedly she had multiple flags adorning her house, and she was known to be patriotic on the 4th of July and other things. So that is definitely not something that I'm tearing down. I really consider it. And I really think that she probably accentuated the fact of being a patriot or a Unionist because of what happened with her father-in-law. I'm sure that Barbara and her husband John waved the flag and made sure that everybody knew that they were in on the system. Yes, ma'am.
As far as the slaves that she owned, were they to work the land?
She just had a couple. She just had a male slave and a woman slave and a younger slave. So it was just ones, I think, that just had that they had a glove manufactory or a little glove business. I think they worked with that and kind of a domestic household slave. So it wasn't anything on a wide scale. One of the stories, the apocryphal stories, is that early in the Civil War, some rebel soldiers, or at least people with Southern sympathies, were sitting on her stoop, and she had her broom, and she, "Get out of here, you rebels! There, we don't need you here on my stoop or there by my well." So there are some of these stories that have been corroborated, but she did have a couple of the different flags, and when I get into the story there, I'll be able to kind of tell you maybe what she did with those flags, and it's not exactly the way that Whittier presented it. But I want to paint the scene going back to 1862. So here we are in September of 1862, and of course that's a favorite month for Dennis Fry, who you mentioned, with his September Suspense, and I'm sure he was here and gave a lecture about that. But in September of '62, that's where Robert E. Lee, fresh off Second Manassas, the victory at Second Manassas, felt that the time was right to cross the river into quote-unquote Union territory, into Maryland, here at Conrad's Ferry, where he would cross over the early part of that month. And the first major Union or northern town that he would bring his Army of Northern Virginia would be Frederick, Maryland. And, I guess Mr. Gillespie could probably talk a lot better on this, but I think that, one of the things, we have Bradley Tyler Johnson, who was a Frederictonian with deep roots back there, and maybe he was the one who got in the ear and said, General Lee, there's a lot of folks up in Frederick who feel, that they've been kind of wrongly held here, that the yoke of tyranny is upon us, and if you make your way to Frederick, you will see a lot of support, a lot of recruits, and I guess by and large only about 100 men would sign up to leave with the Confederacy, but those that rebel army stayed in Frederick for about 5 days, really didn't get the support, the overwhelming support that they had thought. And Lee's next move was to head west, divide up his army. He sent Stonewall to Maryland Heights and Harper's Ferry area. He sent Longstreet to Hagerstown. But this incredible army went west on Patrick Street, our main thoroughfare, the National Road, and they would cross, or they would pass right in front of Barbara Fritchie's house, which I showed you earlier. Now, Barbara Fritchie was said to have been sick and bedridden at the time. There are no accounts of Barbara waving a flag at that Confederate army. There's anybody who's ever looked into it, Henry Kai Douglas wrote a book, I Rode with Stonewall, where he said he was by Stonewall Jackson's side the whole trip. Matter of fact, they even took a circuitous route to see an old friend, a minister there in town at the Presbyterian Church. So they never crossed, even passed in front of Barbara's house. They took another route around, so they would have bypassed. So this whole story of Barbara waving a flag doesn't really hold water. We have in Frederick, one of the greatest people that we have from a history perspective was a fellow named Jacob Engelbrecht. His father was a Hessian soldier captured during the Revolution, and he would end up staying in Frederick instead of going back to the old world. But his son Jacob would keep a diary from basically 1818 through 1878. And he was a busybody, he was a gossip. He knew everything about everything, and it's a great tool, Jacob Engelbrecht's diary, if you have any relatives or you're doing research on Frederick. But he made his political beliefs known. He was a big supporter of the Union, but he lived right across the street from Barbara's house. And it wouldn't be until a year later, in fall of 1863, when Jacob Engelbrecht goes, "What? Barbara Fritchie waved the flag. This is the first I'm hearing about it. I watched that army pass all day, and I didn't see this happen." So those, to me, are some pretty good folks that could corroborate that this story didn't happen. But what probably did happen was just in the days afterwards. General McClellan and the Union Army were in quote-unquote hot pursuit, or as hot as McClellan could do. But they were coming up from Washington trying to figure out what Lee was doing and came there. Yes, ma'am?
I'm sorry, before you moved on, I was just going to mention that the photo you just showed, I believe this one is the only photograph of the Confederate Army on the march through Frederick. And it was only discovered, I think, about 10 years ago.
Yeah, well, it's called the Rosenstock photo, and this Jacob Rosenstock was an amateur photographer, and apparently took this picture out second story. This would be, if you go to Frederick, it would be what we call near the square corner, which is the intersection of Patrick Street. So this would have been taken in that first block of East Patrick, where Patrick and Market intersect. And as she said, it's supposedly the only known photo of Confederates in March. We had, just as an aside, other researchers. And as a matter of fact, there's a guy I met at the library, and Ed probably knows him, but there was a guy who was hanging out at the library doing all these studies, because we've had people come in before and that have studied the way that the sun would have been and all this, and some people are trying to say, well, this wasn't September of 1862 because of this and that. But this one guy set up, he did something last year where it was or a couple years ago, where it was the actual, would have been some kind of anniversary that would have been just right, and he thinks it was taken on Market Street because Rosenstock was originally at North Market Street. But I could do a whole nother lecture on that. So sorry, but thanks for pointing that out, and it's a great shot, and we're lucky to have it. The Historical Society of Frederick actually owns that plate. But
Can I interrupt you? Where were they on their way to? Because I'm not that good at Civil War, but
Sure.
where they were going.
Sure. Well, they had come up to Frederick, and who knows where they were going to go from there. Was General Lee going to use that as a pivot point? Would have he gotten the support of Marylanders? Would he have gone right to Washington, D.C.? Would have he gone to Baltimore? Would he have gone up Gettysburg to Harrisburg or to Philadelphia? Who knows? But from there, when he realized he wasn't really getting the support there, because there's also been books written and stories that maybe Jefferson Davis would have maybe been on his way up. Maybe they could have, if they would have gotten enough support, if they really could have got Maryland to really show true colors, or at least the true colors that they thought. But at this point, he's realizing, and I think one of the lines from the Heart of the Civil War documentary, that these Marylanders were not his Marylanders. So, I'm sure with counsel there, they decided that they were going to head west. That was the best way. The National Road was right there, so they headed west towards Washington County and Hagerstown, Harper's Ferry, and to really get on the other side of South Mountain there, and maybe see what happens. But that's kind of what was happening here this first week. And as a matter of fact, the day that this movement started, it was in the early morning hours of September 10th, 1862, where the Confederates would start heading out. And at the front of the troops, I mean, Stonewall Jackson would have been, at least towards the front, since he had the objective to go to Harper's Ferry. But we think that more so that there are accounts that Barbara Fritchie actually did wave a flag, but she waved the flag at the Union Army. Because McClellan would come in, the Union Army would enter town as the Confederates left. The Union Army then came through Frederick. So just imagine if you're a townsperson at that time too. I mean, they said that you couldn't even cross the streets because it would take hours for these armies to go through. So first you have the Confederate Army going through, and now you've got the Union Army. Now the Union Army, as you can see with this Harper's woodcut here, that people are offering up babies and hats and everything else and waving flags, throwing bouquets. So kind of a different welcoming than the Confederates had seen. Another thing that Dennis Fry said when we did the documentary was, most of the people of Frederick, kept their windows closed, their doors shut, and were just kind of like waiting out the time. When are these Confederates going to leave us? They were kind of in shabby condition at that point too, especially in dress. But a different welcoming here from McClellan. And a couple of the accounts have it that Barbara Fritchie was kind of propped up. This is a picture from the 1950s, but she was kind of propped up at her doorway by her niece, and she kind of waved a flag or had a flag there, which I'm sure was a great sight. You had this woman in her 90s, and she's cheering on the boys. Across the street was another gentleman that, well, I'm going to skip through this a little bit, but there was another gentleman across the street named Joseph Trapnell. I thought I had that on there. Maybe I don't. And he was he was on one side of the bridge, on the opposite side of the street from Barbara, and then Barbara's on this side. So you have two individuals, two nonagenarians, I guess they would be, people in their 90s, waving flags, cheering on troops. And it was Jesse Reno, General Reno, who would be killed a couple days later at the Battle of South Mountain, who supposedly said to his troops, "Look here, boys, it's the spirit of 76," because you had these two individuals there on both sides, and they're waving us on, and the boys gave the huzzah, because they had these incredible cheerleaders who actually, cheered on revolutionary patriots. Supposedly, Reno, and this was written about, but we didn't really get much more because Reno would die a few days later, but supposedly Reno stopped and took tea with Barbara Fritchie. And supposedly Barbara reminded him of his mother, and supposedly wrote his last letter home from Barbara's desk. So we don't know how much, if that's true or that's part of the apocryphal story, but there was a real propaganda machine that I'll tell you about in a few minutes that was churning up this stuff. Now, just to kind of continue, and I guess for your sake as well, for Civil War history here, that both of these armies would go through Frederick. They would meet up at the Battle of South Mountain, is where Lee at least had D.H. Hill in the rear guard there, covering the gaps of South Mountain. And that's where Lee would gather together. He would recall Stonewall and Longstreet. And 3 days after that Battle of South Mountain, they would meet at Antietam, single bloodiest one-day battle in American history. So that was kind of what was happening real time. So Barbara Fritchie, we at least know for sure that she at least was propped up at her doorway and she showed a flag to the Union Army. Now, in the annals of all this heroism and everything, it's kind of like kissing your sister, I guess, to make an analogy, because those were her guys. It's not like, she was wielding the flag and Confederate soldiers were taking shots at her, because that is the way that the story went. And I will tell you a little bit. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, but I'll tell you, for those of you who don't know who Barbara Fritchie was or what we're talking about here, the poem of Barbara Fritchie, because there was the real Barbara Fritchie, the human being we're talking about, and then there was this Barbara Fritchie who was half superhuman, who was waving the flag at the Confederate soldiers on this September 10th, and giving them the business from her dormer, her second-story dormer window. And so a couple Confederate soldiers, probably tired, hot, annoyed, shabby clothing, were kind of like, it's bad enough, with just some of the conditions. We probably have lice, everything else. Now we've got this old woman who's taunting us from above. So supposedly these soldiers, one of the soldiers took a shot at Barbara and her flag, really trying to hit the flag, not Barbara. And he was such a good shot that his blast hit the staff that she was holding, and the staff split in two. And not only was Barbara a very strong Unionist, but she was a very agile 90-plus-year-old, because she was able to reach out and grab the flag before it fell, and then, you Confederates, and then waved it, at them like that. So really fantastic stuff from this lady, born in 1766. But that's the way this poem has it, and supposedly right there at that point, when she's shaking it, the great Stonewall Jackson comes on the scene, because people are saying, oh, there's a commotion, General Jackson. Supposedly he comes on the scene, what's going on here? And these guys are saying, oh, that lady up there, she's taunting us, giving us the business, that stupid rag that she's holding. And that's where Stonewall Jackson's there, and that's where supposedly Barbara utters this famous line, shoot if you must, this old gray head, but spare your country's flag, she said. And supposedly that's where Stonewall got this comeuppance, and he was ashamed for his men shooting at this 90-plus-year-old woman there. And that's where Stonewall gave, which is the second most famous line from this poem, he who harms a hair on yon's head dies like a dog, march on, he said. So, paraphrasing it. Anybody else, let this woman, hey, she's got some moxie, leave her alone. If she wants to wave her flag, she can wave her flag. We got business to attend to, let's move out. But if anybody messes with her, they're going to have to deal with me. That kind of thing. And supposedly, so Barbara got the last laugh or the last wave, and she was seen as the most patriotic of all in Fredericktown. So that is exactly kind of how this poem played out. And on the bigger picture, the bigger stage picture, it really it did a lot for the morale of the North. The South didn't like it at all because it was painting them as barbarians and that they were willing to shoot it at little old ladies waving flags and so forth and so on. But in the North, this was a great rallying call. And again, I could go on another lecture with some of the research that I've done and kind of look at what really went into to that propaganda. But I want to tell you about Mary Quantrell. It's the reason why we're here today. Mary Quantrell lived right up the street in that house right there. We're lucky enough, a book was written in the 1880s that actually captured a picture of Mary Quantrell's house. And I know one thing when I was talking to Ed some months ago in advance of this, he was saying, Chris, how do we spell Quantrell? Because I've seen it spelled Quantrell a lot. But it is the spelling I have up top with the I. That is the correct way that Mary Quantrell is spelled. But I'm going to tell you in a few minutes, too, Barbara Fritchie is spelled multiple different ways as well. So, but there could be a reason for that too. But Mary Quantrell was born in nearby Hagerstown, but she pretty much grew up in Frederick. Frederick was her real true home, other than just being born there in Hagerstown. In early 1862, in September of 1862, she could be found operating a small school for girls there in Frederick out of her mother's home on West Patrick Street, only a block and a half away from Barbara Fritchie's house. It would be a block and a half to the west on West Patrick Street, the National Road. She, in newspaper accounts and others, she has been described as highly intelligent and as a very handsome woman. So when I first came across this fact, probably 15 years ago, or well, maybe it wasn't even that long ago, it was probably 10 years ago, it always kind of stuck in my mind, a very handsome woman. And a couple years ago, I just pulled it out. I was doing a big lecture for our Historical Society with the anniversary, the 150th anniversary of this event. And I came home from work one day and said to my wife, "You're a very handsome woman." And she said to me, "Don't ever say that again." So, but maybe someday it'll come back into vogue. We'll see. But she was, even her son-in-law one of her son-in-laws told a reporter in 1900 she was a very handsome woman. But she was a very good writer, as I found, too, from doing my research, and more on that in a minute. Her maternal grandfather was good Frederick German stock, and he fought, for the Revolutionary War for the right side, unlike Caspar Fritzsche's father. But her brother also was a politician and represented Howard County, Maryland in our 1864 Constitutional Convention, but he was a diehard Unionist, and after the war got appointed, or late in the war got appointed by Abraham Lincoln to be a port collector. But Mary Quantrell's family actually had moved from Frederick at the beginning of the Civil War, or before the Civil War started, and were living in Washington, D.C. And her husband, Archibald Quantrell, who was another native of Hagerstown, he was working for a Washington newspaper. And when the Civil War started, he thought it would be best to position his wife and his multiple kids in Frederick at her mother's house, because Washington wouldn't be a safe place to go, or it would probably be under attack or threatened for attack. And it's kind of funny, because those of you who know Frederick's Civil War story, where multiple times Frederick would come into the fray or be visited by the Confederate Army. We're just lucky we didn't have a battle in town, but we had one south of town in July of 1864 with the Battle of Monocacy. Yes? The Constitutional Convention was all about really giving freedom to slaves. That's the whole story, the interesting anomaly story. Yeah, well, they had a whole convention where they changed the Constitution up. One of the things with Maryland, and really getting into it, if we look at the Emancipation Proclamation and the whole, the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, and then writing, it only freed the slaves in the states that were in rebellion. So Maryland, it was that caveat there that Abe Lincoln, he could not have Maryland fall to the Confederacy. He already had Virginia do that. He could not have his capital surrounded. So Maryland, we never really even took a vote on secession, because what happened, and matter of fact, in 1861, just weeks after the famous Pratt Street riots in Baltimore, where Union troops were attacked by angry mobs of Southern-leaning residents, they decided our state capital of Annapolis in Maryland was a little bit too close to the Confederacy, or at least Southern ties or old-fashioned agrarian ties. So they moved, that summer of '61, they moved the capital to Frederick for that summer. And they were supposed to take a vote on secession. Abraham Lincoln, in working with his top officers, had the order there in effect that any Southern leading delegates, senators that were coming into town or leaving town should be arrested. And a lot of those guys, just like newspaper editors, spent the war in places like Fort McHenry and Fort Warren up in Boston. And it was this whole habeas corpus deal, and that's a lecture for another day too. But one of the things, getting back to it, so when the Emancipation Proclamation came about, it didn't free anybody in Maryland or Delaware for that matter. Slaveholders could still keep their slaves, but it was really kind of a tit for tat kind of thing to keep it. But in 1864, the Constitution was changed, and that was probably the hottest topic within that constitutional change, and that supposedly actually freed the slaves in Maryland at that point. So, getting back to Mary Quantrell, I was able to find her in the 1860 census, living in Washington, D.C. Her husband, again, had this interesting name, Archibald, a name that you don't see, I mean, other than the Archie comics back in the day. I don't know any current-day Archies, maybe some of you do, but Archibald Ritchie Quantrell was his name. And he was born in Hagerstown. His father was an interesting character. He was an officer in the War of 1812, actually led troops to the Battle of Baltimore. But he would actually move to Washington, D.C. after the War of 1812 and bring his large family there, many sons that he had. But Archibald was one of the youngest children, and Archibald had been married once before to a woman named Mary, but he would meet Mary Sands, who was Mary Quantrell, Mary Ann Sands, and they would marry. But as you can see here, Mary Sands was born 1822, it was just, to find the Quantrell name on Ancestry.com in a census search was at least a good name instead of, if she was Mary Ann Smith, I would have been in big trouble. But it really worked out for me. But I really was fascinated, and this goes back years ago. I did this history of Frederick back in 1993 and 94 to air in 95. And one of the things for me that was really fascinating was asking local historians and avocational historians, did she or didn't she? What do you think of Barbara Fritchie? And it was so fun to hear people, oh, I love Barbara Fritchie, and yeah, she did it. And then other people saying, no, she didn't do it, and all this. And it was kind of this neat, the way I edited it together, this back and forth, this yin-yang kind of thing. But it really fascinated me because afterwards I really thought, I wonder who this Mary Quantrell was. I picked it up about 15 years ago, started doing a little bit more research, and then about 10 years ago, and then right when the anniversary came, did a lot, and I was interviewed by some different newspapers and magazines about it. But I had really gone head first into trying to find out who this woman was, because in a way, I kind of felt sorry for her. That she was kind of forgotten to time, much like what I was talking about with that Stories in Stone project, those blogs that I do. But I found that Mary here, so she's up here in Frederick, been kind of sent up here with her kids, and it makes sense. She was a learned woman, and she's teaching a school out of her mother's house. And I found this great, I just found this a couple years ago, this great illustration from a newspaper from the early 20th century. And that woman, it's a very handsome woman there, standing by the door with the flag in hand. But that is supposed to be Mary Quantrell there in front of her house on her front stoop. And supposedly, as I told you the story about Barbara, supposedly what the situation was with Mary Quantrell on that morning of September 10th, 1862, was that she got up early. She had her own girls and neighborhood girls working on lessons. And she decided she had a great stoop in front of her house. She decided to be a spectator of watching all these Confederates walk or, pass her door. So she supposedly sat out on her front porch, and she had supposedly always flown a Union flag, so she made sure it was in place there. And she had that, and she also supplied her schoolgirls, her own daughters and the other neighborhood girls, and there's a list of them right there. She had supplied them with little flaglets, small little flaglets. And supposedly at times, Mary's sitting under the big flag, but the girls are waving their flags, would come out and wave the flags, taunting the Confederate soldiers. What are they going to do to a bunch of young ladies there? So it must have been an incredible visual scene there that was going on, until it got to the point where a couple disgruntled Confederates that were tired of seeing this approached and snatched the flag. Mary was able to snatch it back. They got it, and then they bayoneted it and then dragged it around in the mud and dirt, and were like, see that, lady? And then the girls at that point, supposedly the way the story goes, were hiding their flaglets up their sleeves. But as soon as Mary's flag went down, her daughter came over and gave her one of the flaglets, and then Mary was like that, and then the Confederates had to come back and rip that apart, and then another girl would have it. So again, it must have been an incredible scene, and we get this later from Mary Quantrell actually told this story, and it was corroborated by some neighbors. But so that was what was going on with school teacher Mary Quantrell and these schoolgirls. And a couple years ago, we have a very talented artist in Frederick there, a fellow named Richard Schlecht, and he's done a lot of pieces for the National Park Service all over the country. But I had some grant money and was able to have him. I took him to the site, told him the story, worked with him for a while, and he did this really nice depiction of perhaps what that scene could have looked like with Mary and her daughter. And an officer did approach too, and she says an officer approached, and she says in her account, which would come later, that it was a General Hill. So that's great, but which one is it? Is it AP Hill or DH Hill? So that's one of the things that is a little bit unknown. Now they say that DH Hill was with the rear guard, so he would have been coming through Frederick last, A.P. Hill would have been towards the front, because he would have went with Stonewall. He ends up going down to Maryland Heights. So most likely, if she said it was General Hill, it's probably A.P. Hill. Now, if you've seen any pictures of A.P. Hill before, and if you see pictures of Stonewall Jackson, hey, they kind of look a little bit alike, so maybe some people could have been confused, or A.P. Hill's, connection to Jackson. So anyway, but we did this. He did this nice portrait here. A.P. Hill probably would have been dressed a little bit different. There would have been more red in his uniform. But anyway, it's a nice picture, and we were able to do that for an interpretive wayside in front of the Mary Quantrell house. Well, how did this whole story get relayed to John Greenleaf Whittier? So I told you the story. Yes, ma'am.
Were all their children from Mary Quantrell, or did the first one?
The children that she had there were all Mary's children. All Mary's children. And there were a couple, like I said, neighborhood kids involved too. But one of the most interesting ones is there was a girl who was the oldest of the girls there. There was Mary's daughter, Mary, but there was another girl, well, there was Mary Hitshoe, 3 Marys that were 15. But there was one named Mary Hopwood who plays into the story, and I'll get to that in a little while. But Mary Hopwood. So I was getting back to how did this story get to John Greenleaf Whittier? Because if I said that the diarist refuted the story, that nobody really saw this happen, well, how did a guy up in Massachusetts get the idea to write this story about Barbara Fritchie, who was a real person? But if this really didn't happen, this flag waving and her diving out and getting the flag, if it really didn't happen, how did he concoct it? Well, it's all because this woman right here, Eden Southworth. Has anybody heard of her ever before? Okay, Eden Southworth, her real name was Emma Dorothy Eliza Nevitt. So, I'd go with an acronym too, I guess, if I had a name that long. But she was the top-selling female novelist of the 19th century. And she had started as a school teacher. Her husband kind of ran out on her and her kids. She was a good writer. She decided, well, I've got to make ends meet. So she started writing articles, and then magazines were picking up said articles, and then she was signed the contracts and started writing novels. Now, a lot of her work, especially in the 1850s, centered around the abolitionist movement. That was her standing. She lived in Georgetown at the time of the Civil War, Prospect Cottage in Georgetown. But Eden Southworth was the real key to this whole story, because she would be the one who would make contact to John Greenleaf Whittier, fireside poet from Amesbury, Massachusetts. And if you know anything about the fireside poets there of Massachusetts, like Longfellow and others, that they would write stories about just the human existence, and these would be stories, hence the term fireside poet, stories that families could read there at nighttime around the fireplace and really feel good. And a lot of patriotic things. Just a couple years before Whittier wrote this Ballad of Barbara Fritchie, we would have this fella during the American Revolution who rode through the streets saying the British are coming, the British are coming. And, there was a little bit of embellishment on that as well with the ride of Paul Revere. But John Greenleaf Whittier wrote this, or received some letters from Eden Southworth in the summer of 1863. And I know some of you saw some of the marketing materials and information that Ed put together. This was like the smoking gun for me. I really wanted to see these letters. I had seen footnotes to these letters before. I really didn't know that they still existed. I found an old newspaper article from the 1890s, and it was Whittier's biographer was actually selling a lot of his belongings off after he had passed away, so that they could turn the Whittier house into a museum and preserve it. And in this long auction that they had in New York City, 3 letters were mentioned. 2 letters from Eden Southworth to John Greenleaf Whittier, and there was another letter some years later, 13 years later, from 1876, where Mary Quantrell had written a letter to John Greenleaf Whittier. So I was like, oh my gosh, if I could only find these letters. Well, anyway, I dug and dug and dug and dug, and I was able to find them. And all 3 letters live at the Friends Library. I don't have an exterior shot of it, but the Friends Library in Philadelphia at Swarthmore College. And of course, this is a Quaker college, and John Greenleaf Whittier was a Quaker, pacifist, abolitionist, and his letters and a lot of his other work found its way, was donated. So somebody must have bought these at auction, whether the school did, probably a donor probably bought these and placed them in safekeeping, and now they are in adhesed to volumes there in their collection. So I was able to contact them. Number one, they found them. I was able to find a crazy footnote that led me there, and then I was able to go up and actually touch them. I didn't touch them, but I was right there and got to look at them and take pictures, and I was on cloud 9 looking at these 3 letters. And the letter here, and I'm not going to read it verbatim for you because we'll be here all afternoon. I'm going to keep you here long enough. But the letters, as you can see there, this was in the hand. This is Eden Southworth writing. And this is the second of the 2 letters that she wrote. And I don't want to run out of camera range. But you can kind of see, I'll read here, the top of the second page here. It says, well, there's Stonewall Jackson entered Frederick, every Union flag was lowered. But it's this whole story about this old woman, Barbara Fritchie, like when the Confederates invaded town, that this was the only woman who really opened her windows and was afraid to, or was not afraid to come out. And it says here, the rebel army marched up the street and saw the flag. The order was given, halt fire, and a volley was discharged at the window from which it was displayed. The flag staff was partly broken. And the flag drooped. The old lady drew it in, broke off the fragment, and taking the stump with the flag still attached in her hand, so threw herself out the window and waved it. And she didn't say, shoot if you must. She said, fire at this old head then, boys. It is not more venerable than your flag. So they fired no more. They passed in silence. So it's the Barbara Fritchie ballad, but it just doesn't rhyme yet. And that's what Whittier was for. Now,
You said South?
Eden Southworth was the novelist. Eden Southworth wrote this letter. And actually, this was the second letter that she would write to Whittier. Now, she wrote these letters in July of 1863. The event happened, quote-unquote event happened, would have happened September 10th, 1862. Well, in July 21st of 1863, this was her first letter, short and sweet. She just sent it up to the postmaster of Amesbury. And it says, Friend Whittier, I send this little note out merely in quest of you. If it should find you, please let me know your exact address, as I have a message to deliver you. You need only to put your address in the enclosed envelope. When I get it, I will write to you. So this was the first. We never saw the letters that came back. But so she just sends this blindly up. She knows he lives in Amesbury. He responds back with his address, and then she sends this other story. And she said that really in that letter, she goes, I myself could have written about this woman, but your hand will do it justice. That it really, she goes, when I heard this story, I felt that it belonged in a book with your name on the cover. So she's really buttering him up, but really it's propaganda because they're both abolitionists, and she's looking at like this, boy, if I can get Whittier to write this, boy, this will really help our cause. Now again, this is July of 1863 when this was done. So why didn't this happen in September of 62? Why didn't it happen in October of 62? Just crazy that it took so long for this all to come to light. Well, at this time here in 1863, in July of 1863, Barbara is no longer with us. Barbara actually died the previous December 18th of 1862. Barbara Fritchie passed away of old age. But she lived a great long life there, but she passed away just a few months after this incident happened. So she would never know of this fame that would come to her. But so she would be buried right next to her husband John there in the old German Reformed Cemetery in Frederick, not Mount Olivet, but the German Reformed Cemetery. For those of you who know Frederick, it's today's Memorial Park. It's adorned with World War I, World War II, Korean, Vietnam monuments in it. That was the old German Reformed burying ground, and that's where Barbara would be laid to rest in there. Meanwhile, the other star of the Barbara Frietchie, the Ballad of Barbara Frietchie by Whittier, was none other than Stonewall Jackson. And those of you who know Civil War history, and those of you who don't, Stonewall wouldn't be around in July of 1863 either. He was wounded by his own guys at the Battle of Chancellorsville, and would die just days later. So I guess the old adage, dead men and women tell no tales. So here you have this whole altercation between Barbara Frietchie and Stonewall Jackson, who at that time, Stonewall Jackson in that Maryland campaign of '62 was more famous than Robert E. Lee at that point in time. I've seen things written where parents in the North, if their kids were misbehaving, they would say, you better knock it off, or you better stop now, or Stonewall Jackson's going to get you, kind of like that boogeyman kind of thing. So Stonewall Jackson had this larger-than-life persona. But as I've lectured before and talked about it, it's the typical David and Goliath story here, with little old lady versus, Stonewall Jackson. This poem worked out great because you weren't going to have these stars refute it. And like I said, it just went like wildfire. Now there's a lot of, like I said, I've done a lot of research of why it was written and why I think that those two concocted together to kind of work this propaganda. But if you think about July of 1863, what happened at the beginning of July of 1863? Gettysburg. And Gettysburg, from the Union perspective, was it just a really great victory? Lee was able to escape once again. Lincoln was livid with his leadership again, just like McClellan let Lee escape after the Maryland campaign. Now he was upset again. But what had really happened, and this is the one thing I look at, this is an extra bonus I'll give you here, is has anybody ever seen the movie Gangs of New York? Not one of the most pleasant movies, very graphic violence, and it really illustrates the New York City draft riots of mid-July 1863. And to me, I think there's something there. And this was my whole hypothesis with this. Because you've got on the screen there those two great stories I told you. Little old lady waving the flag or bounding out and grabbing the flag and shaking it at the Confederates who were shooting. And then you've got this school teacher, beautiful, handsome school teacher, and her schoolgirls all lined up, waving the flags. One gets torn apart or whatever, another flag comes out. Great, it's kind of like a Dennis the Menace, Mr. Wilson thing going on there to the Confederates. Equally great stories. But one really happened, one didn't happen. Why did Whittier and Southworth go with the one that can't be corroborated? Well, the lady died, so that helps. But I think it all goes back to that timing. The Battle of Gettysburg. What does Lincoln do right after the Battle of Gettysburg? He issues a draft. He's saying, once and for all, we've got to end this thing. I need all able-bodied men of the North. And who were the able-bodied men he wanted to get? Think back to that Gangs of New York. He wanted the Irish, he wanted the Germans, and these guys were saying, wait a minute, because rich kids were being, were having substitutes, all this. And if you watch that Gangs of New York, it's these guys who are already living in the Bowery and squalor and all are saying, we escaped our home country to come here for a better life. It was bad enough, and we're living in squalor right now. Now we're going to be drafted, and we have to fight this rich man's war to get what? To put our lives on the line, and if we win it, we can win freedom for blacks who we're competing with jobs against, whether it's longshoremen or other jobs, especially in these cities of the North. No way. And that's where during those New York City draft riots, they went into recruiters' office and killed union recruiters. They lynched blacks, burned buildings. Some historians say it was almost a Confederate victory in the North, those draft riots, because it showed the North isn't as unified as you would think. But this is why I really think that Southworth and Whittier went with Fritchie over Quantrell. Fritchie was German. Maybe, just maybe, if you show in that David and Goliath story that an immigrant was harmed by these nasty Southerners here who would do nothing more than go after old ladies and kids or whatever, maybe you could win the support that way. A lot of guys, too, were coming up, a lot of those Union soldiers. Think about it if you're from Maine and you've served your enlistment and you thought this was supposed to be a cakewalk and now they wanted you to re-up, and you're thinking, do I really, maybe we don't need the South after all. We've got industry up here and everything else. Maybe we don't need those troublemakers from South Carolina or anything like that. So it was this rallying call that really played on the emotions, and that's what this poem did. And John Greenleaf Whittier was the perfect person to write it. And Southworth, to have maybe even a male write this story would even be better about a female character. It's interesting because Southworth herself was known because of the way her life with her husband running out on her, and she was kind of seen as this strong woman who really provided for her family at the time, that a lot of her leading characters were these strong women. So she had two good ones to choose from in Quantrell and Fritchie, but I really think that's why she went. But there's one more part of it. Yes, ma'am.
Well, as a novelist myself, you came up with a couple of very good facts that might also factor into your hypothesis. One, Martha Fritchie, she was a Revolutionary War individual, not like the beautiful 40-year-old teacher. And one other thing, did you notice how many 15-year-old girls were in Mary's schoolyard? What was the age of those Confederate soldiers coming through?
Well, yeah.
16. So now you've got a bunch of 16, 18-year-old boys being mocked by a small group of 15-year-old girls. That isn't quite as inspiring than the elderly grandmother we all had. Who was a revolutionary.
Good, very good point.
And another thing, neither of the little generals were that well known. There goes another X for Mary. Stonewall Jackson, as you said, he was already established as the scary guy who came into this. And say with Eden, hey, we're going with the noble and not the dust up. Teenage boys and teenage girls on the streets of Frederick. It's good for one angle, but not the noble inspirational angle we might be looking for. And probably, General Lee was very concerned that nobody aggravate or taunt or bother people in Frederick because he was still hoping that they would have some welcome. So anyone would probably have stopped the hijinks, any general or any leader. But the teenage girls, the teenage boys thing, that's a different novel.
That's a neat way to put it. I really like that. But I want to tell you the slam dunk on top of it. Yeah. No, I'm going to tell you about the third letter in a minute. The slam dunk is what's in a name. What's in a name? Fritchie, and what happened here, and you'll see in a slide in a few minutes, when Barbara Fritchie's name, it was anglicized by the time she was using it. At the time of her life in the 1860s, it was Fritchie. That's the way we spell Barbara Fritchie, and that's the way it is up there. Barbara Fritchie, as you can see on the slide. When Whittier writes the poem, he writes the Ballad of Barbara Fritchie, he puts an extra E in there. He kind of goes back, and I really think that's playing again towards not the anglicized version, but the old German version. Sometimes you see it with an SCHIE too. So again, I think trying to play on that realm there of trying to get the immigrant there to calm down and join the cause. But as I say, what's in a name? The Fritchie name's over here, but the other lady's name was more controversial. Now, we know it here today, Mary Quantrell. Remember I told you that the Quantrells came from Hagerstown. There was this Captain Quantrell, Thomas Quantrell, who led the family down to Washington, D.C. Well, he had many sons. The oldest of those sons, he was the oldest or second oldest, his name escapes me right now, but he would move out to Dover, Ohio. And he would have a son who was a little bit disgruntled. He was a school teacher, but he became a little bit more disgruntled as he saw the makings of the American Civil War. Well, this fella, William Clark Quantrell, did not think much about the abolitionist movement. And he would gather together some of his closest friends, who would also be known as some of the lowest of the low, the greatest outlaws of the Wild West, Cole Younger, and Jesse James, Frank James, you know these guys. But he gathered them together and created his own little group, Quantrell's Raiders. Now, this would, in a way, make him related to Mary Quantrell. Mary Quantrell, I'm sure, probably never even met William Clark Quantrell. But Mary was married to the uncle. So Uncle Archie. So William Clark Quantrell's Uncle Archie was Mary Quantrell's husband. Now, that name just being a rare name, Quantrell, much like the realm of Hitler or Nixon, that sometimes people are like, ooh, you know, I don't want to offend anybody. I mean, they're lovely names that go way back, and unfortunately, one person ruined the situation in either case, one worse than the other. But I think that you couldn't have the ballad of Mary Quantrell. I just don't think that would have really resounded the same way. That, like I said, is kind of a slam dunk that I have in there. Interestingly, it was a month, I told you, that Mary wrote that first letter, July 21st. William Clark Quantrell had already been doing his little raids and all that stuff. He was already a big public enemy #1 for the Union. But 1 month after those letters were written, or in August of '63, William Clark Quantrell would go into Lawrence, Kansas, and he, in the broad daylight, he and his men would kill any male old enough to even hold a gun in their hand, a rifle. And these men and boys were massacred in the street. So that did wonders for Quantrell's reputation. And like I said, I think that's another reason why Mary Quantrell wouldn't get her due fame. Barbara Fritchie, I said about the German spelling. This is an old woodcut, even spelled Barbara Fritchie's Defiance there. And Barbara Fritchie, like I said, there was the real Barbara Fritchie that we know and love, the feeble old lady, kindly old lady, unionist, yes. But then it's this superhero waving the flag and all these great images that exist of her leaning out of that second-story dormer window. And the best one, N.C. Wyeth, the famed illustrator artist, did the one in the middle. That's one of the best, and I think holding the flag after you can see the shaft has been broken in the window and everything. So Barbara was right in harm's way there, but she didn't care. She put her gray head out there for her country. As I said, that house would stand, and after the poem came out, that local photographer, Jacob Byerly in Frederick, decided, boy, I've got the picture of my aunt through marriage here. I could sell the pictures of her. Even Matthew Brady got in on the act and got some licensing there so he could sell stereo or cabinet cards there with Barbara's face on it and put the poem on the back. But also the house, pictures of the house would be sold. And I love this picture here. You can see the flag sticking out the window. I mean, I'm sure they didn't have Photoshop back in the 1860s, but whatever they had, that flag wasn't really, I can't imagine that flag being there, but that was the original Barbara Fritchie house. Now, unfortunately, and this plays into the story, unfortunately, a few years later, after this whole event happened, the Barbara Fritchie house would be heavily damaged by a storm that came up in the spring of '68. and damaged the house so much so that people were thinking, is it worth saving or not? Now, Barbara Frietchie's a superstar. Everybody knows who Barbara Frietchie is because this poem was so famous at the time. People were coming to Frederick to see that Barbara Frietchie house. But the powers that be, the town fathers of Frederick, decided, wow, we really need to widen the creek right there at the bend where the Barbara Frietchie house is so that we don't get flooded out. You can see this is a picture of the flood. Barbara Frietchie's house would have been up to the left about midway down the street. So there was all kinds of damage done, and they figured if we broaden the creek there, then we'll be okay. It's funny because we had a big flood in 1976 in Frederick, and now we have this kind of poor man's San Antonio, this creek project in the middle of town. But that's exactly what they wanted done. Now, people were saying, well, why do you want to rip down Barbara Frietchie's house? She's a superstar. Well, interestingly enough, too, I found that the mayor, the sitting mayor of Frederick, was a guy named Valerius Ebert, who was another grandnephew. Barbara never had kids. Remember I told you John didn't want an offspring to live with that same shame, and that's why he married a lady beyond her childbearing years at that time. But I found these articles here from 1968 and 69 respectively. But that is where the Board of Aldermen under Mayor Valerius Ebert, who was a well-known Southern sympathizer during the Civil War and asked to leave multiple times, kicked out of Frederick. Now he's the mayor of Frederick, and he and the aldermen decide we've got to rip down the house. Well, I think they wanted to rip down the house because they figured if they ripped down the house, they'd quit having people coming in asking questions, and they would get rid of this awful Union story. They were still a little sore maybe that the Union had been victorious in the war. So they put a whole thing out there to accept bids for whatever contractor wants to come in and do the removal of the house. Interestingly enough, a local contractor named James Hopwood would win the bid. His daughter, Mary Hopwood, was one of those 15-year-old girls. And she was the one that Mary Quantrell says she was the one right by her side really helping the most. So I really think that on this street here, West Patrick Street, you had, well, two gangs there too. You had the Quantrell supporters and you had the Frietchie supporters. And I think that these families of the girls that were with Mary Quantrell were just like, my God, get rid of this story because she really didn't do it. Our Lady's the one who did it. But James Hopwood removed, it was kind of a shady deal there of how it went down, but he won the bid there, was able to dismantle the house. And this is what the scene would look like. This is a picture from the early 20th century here, but there's a bridge there where the Frietchie house used to be. And actually, they had signs at different points saying this tablet marks the spot where the Barbara Frietchie house stood. Supposedly, Hopwood and the other characters who took down the house, supposedly, from that second-story dormer window, they were able to salvage the wood from that, and they made canes out of it. And they made these wooden canes with a tip, and it says this cane made from timber from the attic window of Barbara Frietchie's house, Frederick, Maryland. Now, I would think, Miss Bellell, well, it wasn't probably Hopwood. Hopwood probably said somebody else wanted industrious, because I'm sure he didn't want these canes hanging around. But Whittier, there are a couple of these canes up at the Whittier Museum up in Massachusetts. I don't know. I haven't been able to find that. But, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, yeah, how many attic? Yeah, we have plenty. But, I think, and for any of you who have eaten, and now that the now defunct or gone Barbara Frietchie Candy Stick Restaurant, I always kind of think, were these canes, were they something back in the day, or they wanted them to be something, and maybe that's why the Candy Stick Restaurant, maybe that's what the whole stick, walking stick, candy stick kind of thing. But... Well, and they spelled Frederick wrong too. So whoever the entrepreneur was really didn't do their history work. They were just selling canes as fast as possible. So selling canes, raising cane, they were doing all of it. But this whole thing about the flood was very interesting, a very interesting piece of the puzzle. And I really looked carefully at it because I found over 50 letters to the editor like in large papers, especially like the New York newspapers, of people saying, "Oh my gosh, they're ripping down the Barbara Fritchie house. This can't be done. She's a national treasure. Why are they ripping down this house?" And then people started, "I was with the Army and I saw her waving the flag." And people were giving all these stories, and she did, she didn't. And that's usually what would happen with anniversaries. But one of the greatest things that happened out of all this flood and this demolition is that people were taking to these letters to the editor and praising Barbara Fritchie. And one of Mary's grown sons finally had had enough. He had seen the pain that his mother had gone through, kind of being in the shadow and kind of being dismissed during this whole, and Barbara Fritchie's rise to fame and Barbara Fritchie's errors, taking advantage of the whole situation. But in all of this, her son, Mary's son, wrote a letter to the Washington Star newspaper defending his mother, and said she was the real lady who waved the flag on that day, and her bravery is unbridled. And Barbara Fritchie was a real nice lady and a unionist, but it was really her mother. He got lambasted, big time. So much so that Mary herself came out, and Mary actually, just such a great writer she was, she wrote an account, first-person account of what happened. And that's where she mentions General Hill and the whole story there of a very kind of a chivalrous story too, that yeah, the goons had come up and cut the flags and the girls gave her the flag, you know, and all this. But it was a general who finally came up, and the general said, "Ma'am, I salute you, not your," took his hat off, "I salute you, but not your flag." He said that General Lee wanted the flag because he had heard, I guess, the scuttlebutt up and down the line was, wow, there's this woman with moxie up there who's waving the flag, and maybe it was attractive to some of those guys too, like, oh, and they got these 15-year-old girls, they're great too, waving the flag. But supposedly General Lee, she says, wanted the flag. He was being driven in an ambulance through town, and that's where she said, you know, General Lee cannot have my flag. And the officer said, why? And she goes, "I think it is worthy of a better cause." And the officer said, "But your flag has been dishonored." And she says, "Well, only because of you guys," and all this. But it's amazing. There was this whole story that was in this newspaper, and then it was pulled, and New York papers and other papers printed this thing. And the result of it, even more anger towards Mary Quantrell, because people were starting to say, wait a minute, she's trying to step on the coattails of the great Barbara Fritchie, and Barbara Fritchie's not here to defend herself. Who is this sham? She's just trying to cash in on this. And from that point on, Mary Quantrell was scorned. She couldn't get jobs. And she was back in Washington, D.C., because Frederick, Maryland wasn't big enough for, I guess, 2 flag toters. And I really think that, again, it was affecting her health. And it was just a real bad scene. So much so that in 1870, I searched and searched through the census records because I wanted to find the family in 1870. And I just could not find them anywhere. And I looked and I looked and I looked. And I did all these little tricks of the trade because of her daughters having different names. Her youngest daughter, Virgie, I thought that's a good one. And I did searches, and Archibald was that key for me. How many Archibalds were around in 1870 in Washington, D.C.? But I find them. Archibald Ritchie. They had banned the last name. So Archibald Ritchie, so to think that they were that, they really had to go underground, I think. That's kind of part of the sadness here, that in 1870, they're under the Ritchie family and not Quantrell. And that's thanks to William Clark Quantrell, too. I'm sure people had made the connection at that point as well. So that leads us to your question there of this letter that I found. So in July of 1876, 13 years after Eden Southworth wrote those first 2 letters to John Greenleaf Whittier, Mary Quantrell would write a letter of her own to John Greenleaf Whittier, and this is in that collection there at Swarthmore. And she introduces herself, and she says, "I'm sure that you've heard about me." But the gist of this beautiful letter, this incredibly written letter, is she's saying to Whittier, "My life has really gone to pot. And hey, Barbara Fritchie was a fine woman. I knew her, I grew up in the town, and she was a fine woman, as there were many fine women of Frederick that waved the Union flag and supported the Union cause. But she says, but I'm being scorned, and you're the only one who can help me. If you can at least give me a nod, kind of say, hey, Mary Quantrell, did something. This poem was kind of based on all these patriotic women, whether they were here, whether they were in Hagerstown, wherever they were. Could you do that for me? And she's like begging them.
And what is the date?
1876.
So the centennials, a week after the national centennials, and she's doing.
Well, probably that too, because Barbara Fritchie probably got another, they were probably selling Barbara Fritchie decorative plates and everything else for the, because she was put on this pantheon. And that's where John Greenleaf Whittier continued to keep quiet. And so did Eden Southworth. Eden Southworth, I'm sure, living in the same town, I'm sure she lobbied Eden Southworth. She probably heard that Eden Southworth, because for years Whittier would not reveal his source. And he almost got backed into a corner. So many people were questioning this story and this event, and I think he just kind of had to create lies to kind of continue covering it up. And finally, at the time of his death, he goes, well, it was told to me, so if I'm not right, it's not my fault. But unfortunately, he didn't come to the defense of Mary Quantrell. And Mary died just 3 years later in 1879. She was only 56 at the time. I found out that she did die of heart failure. And I think, I'm sure there's a medical cause, but I think to wax poetic, I think it's a broken heart. I think this probably just stressed her out so much, this up and down, this whole thing here. And I think the thing that was most interesting is Ed and I share a common stomping ground of the Maryland room there at the Seabrook Arts Library. But it's one of the places, especially those of you, most probably of you in this room do research. We read books and we see it, but it's like, go to those original sources and see what they say. And I didn't know when Quantrell died. I couldn't find her on Find a Grave. I couldn't find, I dug around and around, and finally when I did find out, because I got her death certificate, I had to write for her death certificate, and found where she was buried and when she died. But I went back into the Frederick newspapers, and two of the newspapers of note here, and this is one of them, the Frederick Daily News, as you can read here, Miss Mary Quantrell, formerly of this place, but who for some years has resided in Washington, died suddenly in that city. The deceased was a lady who, during the war, waved the American flag in the face of Stonewall Jackson on the occasion of his passage through this city. This act on the part of the deceased gave rise to John Greenleaf Whittier's poem, Barbara Fritchie. So it's like the generation that was alive during the Civil War, they kind of knew what the deal was. And there was another longer account, but it doesn't make for a great slide. But in our other newspaper, the Frederick Examiner, where it says Mary, the wife of Archibald, sister of the late George Sands, died in Washington. It said here, Mrs. Quantrell was a native of this county, and for a number of years during her maidenhood taught school. About Frederick, she was a lady of fine mental culture and possessed an ardent and abiding convictions. During the War of the Rebellion, she was an intense loyalist by word and deed, manifesting her devotion. And I'm wondering, too, if she's got that name Quantrell, did she accentuate the positive just like Barbara Fritchie was doing? Did she say, hey, I know you've heard the name Quantrell before, but I'm a Union-loving Quantrell. But at the time of the rebel invasion, her residence was on West Patrick Street in this place, for which a large portion of the Army passed on their way to Antietam. It was on the occasion that she waved a Union flag from her doorstep in the presence of the rebel horde, by one of whom it was stricken from its staff. Then it was that seizing a flaglet held by her little daughter standing by, she flaunted the stars and stripes the more defiantly and heroically before the moving host. The authenticity of this daring deed is based not only on the recorded testimony of Mrs. Quantrell herself, but is unequivocally substantiated by the evidence of several neighbors still living that were present during the time. So it is highly probable that the Barbara Fritchie heroism embalmed in Whittier's poem owes its rise from this patriotic incident. Wow! I mean, I was on cloud nine in the Mar. If Ed would have been there, I would have given him high fives. I'm like, has nobody gone after this before? But it's, again, nobody knew when Mary Quantrell wasn't, I mean, you can't find it in books when she died. So that was quite a find, and you can find this on eBay. I have a couple editions of it, but this fellow named Nixdorf in 1887, a Frederick resident, he actually was a storekeeper who was located, it was the, I'm trying to think, it's called the La Park Restaurant now. It used to be called Jennifer's Restaurant in Frederick on West Patrick Street, right near where Bent's connects with Patrick. But he's basically in the middle of both houses, and he had to mind his store because Confederates, he sold hats and clothing and boots and stuff, and there were a lot of Confederates coming into the store there, and he was afraid of looting. So he had to kind of stay in there, but he notes in his book, which he really wrote as a defense, because then people started beating on Barbara Fritchie, and she did nothing wrong to deserve. She didn't know she'd be the center of all this controversy, but he wrote about her. But he also writes about Quantrell. That's where the picture of Quantrell's house is in this book. But he wrote that I saw a commotion in front of Mary Quantrell's house. There was an officer, there were soldiers, there were neighbors, and he got like 10 neighbors to sign an affidavit saying she definitely did this. She definitely waved these flags and was accosted by the Confederate Army, and she was this heroine. So another neat thing, he also talks, he was the one who told the story about this Reverend Trapnell on the lower left in General Reno, saying, hey boys, look, it's a Spirit of 76. So, all this stuff is happening in the 1870s, 1880s, years after, as we're starting to change into another generation. But Whittier passes away in 1892. Southworth would die 7 years later. And as I said, neither one of them come to Barbara's defense. One of the things that was so neat for me was to find out how Eden Southworth concocted or came up with this story. And in a rare interview, she said at one point, she said that she heard it from a descendant or a relative of Barbara's. He would be another great-grandnephew, a guy named Cornelius Steely Ramsburg, whose, I guess it was his mother, was a niece of Barbara's, and through one of Barbara's sisters. And that's where supposedly he was on a wedding trip in the fall of '62 in the Northeast. He came through Frederick in December. Somebody said, hey, you want to stay an extra day? Your great aunt Barbara passed away. You want to go to the funeral service? And supposedly at this funeral service or the after party, he heard this whole story about Barbara's heroics during the war. He was a real estate agent down in Georgetown, and he was friendly with Eden Southworth and supposedly told her this story or parts of it. So that is where it came concocted. And one of the neat things I found that I looked at the small print in Eden Southworth's obituary, it says there, and I guess part of it's cut off because of the way the screen is there, but it says the pallbearers were blah, 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 blah. But one of her pallbearers was Cornelius S. Ramsburg. So this guy, this relative of Barbara's, it was the one who told her the story. So I always thought that was kind of a neat connection too. And another neat thing was in 1900, a fellow named Clyde Fitch, a playwright, wrote a stage play called Barbara Fritchie. It was a younger, hipper lead star. It wasn't our lovable 95-year-old. But in this, again, the papers, every time Barbara Fritchie's name would come up, it was the whole, did she do it, did she not do it? And one of the interesting stories in a Washington interview, Washington Post interview, was with Virgie Quantrell, one of the young daughters of Mary. And Virgie told the whole story, said, they asked, why didn't your mother talk to the press about her heroics if she was in her? Because they said the press came to the door, but mother wouldn't answer it, or we had to send them away. And supposedly said that her mother, it just wasn't right that time of day, that back in the 1860s, for a woman. She goes, father was down at Washington, D.C., and he spoke for the family on behalf of the family, and mother didn't think it was right. And here's a lady who writes all these letters to the editor and all this stuff like that, but she just felt at the time, during wartime, that it wasn't time for grandstanding, and it wasn't her place to be talking to the press about waving the flag of what she did earlier in that day. And supposedly the daughter says, so the press just ran down to Barbara Fritchie's house, and supposedly her nieces and nephews were ready to cash in, and they're telling all kinds of stories. So we'll never really get to the bottom of it. But that's what it's at. As far as Mary Quantrell, I could never find a picture of her. I was a little disappointed when I did find. I found in Munsey's Scrapbook magazine, this is about 3 years ago, I found this online. I found an online edition of this magazine where they actually did this story in 1908, which was the real Barbara Fritchie. And they actually talk about Mary Quantrell and this whole thing. I mean, that would have saved me a heck of a lot of time if I would have found this first. But no, I was really excited to find that picture of Mary and the picture or this little artist illustration here on the side. Boy, that would have helped Richard Schlecht out too. But it was really neat to find and to see it. So with all of that said, you know, Mary Quantrell died at 56. Barbara Fritchie's legend continued, and especially as the generations went by, it got more and more embellished. But people were coming to Frederick, and it was one of those things. Now the house is gone. Barbara's grave site was there in the old Reformed church, but it's that whole, just like Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. Well, people are coming to Frederick to see, we want to see the gravesite, or we want to see the home. We want to see the home of the great Barbara Fritchie, where she waved that flag out that second-story dormer window. So the businessmen at town were kind of thinking, wait a minute, people are coming. We got to build something already. And we had just built a new fancy hotel, the Francis Scott Key Hotel there in town, first state-of-the-art, and businessmen were coming in. And that's where some of our own local businessmen thought, you know, why don't we recreate the house? So in 1927, in the name of tourism and economic development and commercialism, we built the Barbara Fritchie House and Museum. They had to take out another house that was already in place because her house would have been where the creek is, and they rebuilt her house. They did such a fine job that Henry Ford would send some of his workers down. He was creating this Greenfield Village up there in, I'm trying to think what, Dearborn, Michigan. He had the Dearborn Hotel, but he was creating this Greenfield Village, which would eventually, we know the big museum that's up there now, the collection. But he wanted to have 22 homes, was his original plan, but he built 8 homes of great Americans. I think there was Patrick Henry's house and Walt Whitman, but he built these little replica cottages of each of their homes, which you could stay in. And they still exist today. I did another piece about 8-9 years ago talking about the commercialization of Barbara Fritchie, and I actually called up, it's now Marriott or Hyatt, somebody owns the up there, and I talked to the young lady at the desk, and I asked her, and she told me all the amenities. The Barbara Fritchie cottage has a hot tub and all this nice. I mean, Barbara would have loved that after a long day of waving the flag and taunting Confederates. There's nothing better than getting in a hot tub, But I call, so I'm asking her all these questions. She's telling me all about it, and there's a little refrigerator, and we could cook if we wanted to stay there and all this stuff. So at the very end of it, my last question, I said, I have one more question. She told me the cost and everything. And I said, so who was this Barbara Fritchie? And she goes, sir, I have no earthly idea. I said, if you've got 5 hours, I can tell you everything you need to know. And then she hung up on me. So, but the Barbara Fritchie, this little museum would work, and thousands upon thousands of folks would now have a spot in Frederick to come, and they could walk away with a Barbara Fritchie souvenir, a paperweight, or little pennant. I mean, you see these things are on eBay all the time, or postcards. As far as, once again, for locations, this is a look. You're looking here on West Patrick Street, at the top of the hill on West Patrick Street, where West Patrick meets Jefferson Street, for those of you familiar with Frederick geography. You're looking east, and this would have been, of course, the route that Confederate Army and the Union Army would have used as they were heading towards us to head west out of town. But you can see by the arrows the Quantrell House, and then down about a block and a half where the Fritchie House location is. So it was pretty darn close where these incidents supposedly happened. I went some years ago when I was doing this project, about now it's about 6 years ago. A fellow named Scott McCaskill is a financial investment guy, and he owns the Mary Quantrell House. So you could imagine his surprise when I show up one day at the door. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Chris Hall, and hey, have you ever heard of Mary Quantrell? So he was delighted with the story there. And just excited, you know, to tell his clients about this. So at least I'm thinking, well, at least we got one real house. It's the actual Mary Quantrell house as opposed to the replica Barbara Fritchie house. But the one thing, getting back to that Barbara Fritchie, she did put Frederick on the map. Our symbol of Frederick, the clustered spires of Fredericktown, another part of John Greenleaf Whittier's great poetry there, in there. And we still use that today, the logo. It's part of the logo of the city, and we use it tourism, and it's always been used for brochures. But as far as Barbara herself, in 1913, Barbara's body and John's body were moved to Mount Olivet Cemetery, the cemetery where I work, and moved over there and reinterred there. They were going to, there was talk afloat with the Barbara Fritchie Memorial Association that they wanted to build a monument, rivaling the Washington Monument, to Barbara Fritchie. That's an actual postcard that the association used as part of their fundraising. And they wanted to put that up there at the intersection of 7th, it would be 7th Street and Market Street as they come together. We have a fountain there now, but they wanted to put that. The United Daughters of the Confederacy out of Baltimore raised a fit. When they heard about this, they said, no, this fabrication has gone on long enough, and we are not going to just sit here quietly and see this behemoth go up. So they had to kind of switch their plans, and we have a more modest shaft there that was erected in 1914, a year after they brought the bodies over, and that is what we have today. And we have some really fun looking descendants. They all have sourpusses on there, but these are descendants of Barbara Fritchie, probably upset that they don't have the larger monument. And of course, Barbara Fritchie's name would live on in the 20th century thanks to not only tourism, but candy, the Barbara Fritchie candy. I wrote a story a couple months ago about the fellow who opened up the Barbara Fritchie candy stick restaurant, and his name was Amon Kramer, but he created the Barbara Fritchie candy back in the early 20th century. It's neat because I've talked to some old timers of Frederick, and I've asked them, so how was that Barbara Fritchie candy? Most of them say it was awful. And one woman, a woman named Trita Michelle, her brother was Senator Mac Mathias, lives in one of the courthouse square right by the old city hall, one of the beautiful old townhouses we have there. She said that her parents would not allow the kids to eat it. It was just bad candy, and we weren't allowed to touch it. So, but plenty of other people did. And again, I'm just sorry. I think a lot of us are sorry that the Candy Stick Restaurant is no more, at least for now. But the home is still there. But this, in the last couple of years, has come under some controversy because it was put up for sale by a family that had owned it, a lady named Maggie Klein, her husband Dick Klein, who bought it in the 60s, and it operated as a museum in the days of museums, of old house museums, and of course, as we kind of took with the straw poll at the beginning here, how many people know Barbara Fritchie? How many people are excited about visiting the Barbara Fritchie house? But it really had seen less and less visitation. It wasn't open that often. We have interpretation outside of it. But a fellow named Marvin Alsherman, a local developer, bought it a couple years ago at auction. Did some renovations. It was hoping to give it to our historical society. Our historical society really didn't have the energies and the monies to operate it. But a fellow named Brian Cheney just a couple months ago bought it from the Alshermans, and he's opening up a bed and breakfast in it. So, well, it's not really a bed and breakfast. Let's just say it's kind of much like those cottages up at Greenfield. So you have to make your own breakfast, but you can stay in the Barbara Fritchie house. So I'm really excited because he's going to try to keep some of the interpretation there, and it's not going to be ripped down for a 7-Eleven or anything. But matter of fact, if any of you are interested, this Saturday, April 14th, from 11 a.m. to 5 p.m., he's having an open house. So he's been doing renovations. He's going to have an open house, and there's a grand prize drawing to be the first person to stay in there, I think the following weekend. So you can apply on, I think, through eBay or some Facebook or whatever. But anyway, there's a web address, which is also cut off, www.barbarafritchie.org, which I invite you to look at there. On that, Marvin Alsherman at least did a nice website on Barbara Fritchie, and a couple years ago hired me to do some documentary films. So I have more of the focus. I don't really talk about Mary Quantrell that much in there, but I have some great historians discussing, did she or didn't she, and how it happened, why it happened. But that's it for Barbara Fritchie. But as far as Mary Quantrell, I wanted to, I was hoping to find her some years ago before I got her death certificate. I was hoping that she would be in Mount Olivet. She's not, but her brother and mother are in Mount Olivet, but they're in unmarked graves, which is really sad. I just think, again, the family was destitute. I mean, they really took a hit. And also, maybe by that affiliation, even though his name was Sands. But we also have the grave of Mary Hopwood. Mary Louisa Hopwood was that 15-year-old, one of the girls. She would die in 1864. So she died shortly, like a year after the poem. So it's kind of no wonder, I think her dad was excited to rip down that Barbara Fritchie house in 1869 because he really probably felt that his daughter was not given the praise that she deserved. I did find that death certificate, and it was a gold mine for me. Quantrell, again, spelled differently. It was spelled Quantrille, but I found that she was buried in a cemetery called Glenwood Cemetery. Glenwood is basically, it's probably, I would say, about 10 blocks northeast of the Capitol. That's where she was buried. I contacted the cemetery some years ago, and I was so excited to get down there. Definitely, they didn't know who Mary Quantrell was. They didn't know who Barbara Fritchie was either. But they said, hey, but we've got, in the register book, got the whole family, and I'm like, I'm coming down. I came down, was so excited. I wanted to go to the gravesite of Mary and pay my respects. There's the register there with all the Quantrells and when they died, how they died. I went to the gravesite, nothing. The only one that was marked was Virginia Quantrell Brown. It's probably because she has that married name of Brown. But she was the one who wrote that story there about her mother not talking to the press. But nothing. The whole Quantrell family, no stones. And it just, again, I haven't found anything yet that says why, but I can only hypothesize that, again, their name was Mudd. And really sad. So I'm hoping one day I can garner enough support and put a stone on that grave, especially for Mary. But one of the things that comes back to is that poem. And we didn't do a group recitation of the poem in here. Maybe I should have done that, had handouts, and we could have all done that. But the poem ends with this couplet, or this line here. It says, "And ever the stars above look down on thy stars in Fredericktown." And I've always wondered, and I wrote a journal piece about this, that if Whittier was only talking about one lady, Barbara Fritchie, he would have used the singular star, wouldn't he? Why did he pluralize stars? Because there was probably maybe more than one Barbara Fritchie? Perhaps so. I was able to right the wrong. As a matter of fact, it was exactly 4 years ago. We have an event called Bell and History Day. It's the opening of the museum season in Frederick County. And in working with that fellow Scott McCaskill, who owns the Mary Quantrell House, I asked him if he would come up with some money to that illustration I have made. We wanted to put together an interpretive panel. So here in front of the Mary Quantrell House, you can see to the right of the stoop is one of those tabletop interpretive panels, and it tells the story of Mary Quantrell. Has that beautiful artwork that I had Richard Schleck do. And Scott went one step further. He not only painted the building really nice and they put in a new sidewalk. He worked with the city to put a new sidewalk in there, but he also has a flag flying there every business day, which really makes me happy every time I drive by. And that's his tribute to Mary Quantrell. So he gets it, and I'm really pleased with that. And hopefully this fellow, this Brian Cheney, with this little bed without breakfast or whatever it is there, that at least the house will continue to at least inform new generations of who Barbara Fritchie was. But please don't bring back that candy. From what I've heard. So that is the end. I've given you probably more than you needed to know about Barbara Fritchie and Mary Quantrell, but it's one of those things that really you kind of look back, and I think, I'm sure with some of Ed's stories too, and any of you who do history and when you do your own genealogy, that you have a certain sadness for certain people. And I really think that Mary Quantrell, even though maybe her story wasn't written for multiple reasons or because of that last name, I just have some sadness for her in a way. And I hope that she's looking down on me saying, good job, kid, you did all right. So we'll see what we can do more. At least I've told you the story of Mary Quantrell. Thanks again.
That was terrific. You will have noticed we didn't charge you for this lecture. We don't sell tickets, we don't charge admission at the door, but we do pass the hat to give you a chance to show your appreciation for this wonderful talk we just heard. And here come the baskets. And I'm sure you'll take some questions too.
I will take, yeah, all questions, any questions, yeah.
Did you say that on the census in 18-something, 70, 80, that Mary was married Richie?
Richie, 1870 census, yeah.
Have you thought of the play on words? My name's Mary. Richie rhymes with,
Barbara Fritchie.
yeah.
Very nice. Hadn't thought about that. Oh, good, yeah. Well, that's something. It's really good. Yes, sir.
As you were laying this out, and told us to give you these two lines, because to me, both women wave flags.
I think the whole thing, I think Barbara Fritchie was patriotic. And I think the whole thing, I think she was also a personification of the Union abiding and supporting Frederick, Maryland. That here was this Confederate Army that came in looking for supporters, and the town, I mean, maybe most of them hid inside, but they stayed loyal to the Union. And I think Barbara, and maybe it goes back to that whole Germanic story where by and large those German immigrants coming in and they're thinking, look, we just left upheaval in the old world here, don't go messing it up. I mean, it's the whole story too of, as you see, with why West Virginia is West Virginia, especially that Panhandle. You know, the Panhandle there, really supportive of the B&O Railroad. I'm sure, I think you've had Dan Toomey here before to speak. So, and Doug Parks. Yeah, so those guys, I mean, it's just an incredible thing as you go along and to look at that German support. So I think there were, Middletown, another town right across the river, there was a young lady named Nancy Krause, but she went by Nancy. She's buried in our Mount Olivet Cemetery. But supposedly there's a story with her that she was, as a young girl, was a Unionist. She had a Southern sympathizer who owned a hotel across the street, right on the main drag there on 40, there, the National Road, and she hung a flag out on the face of her building there to taunt him. Some young whippersnappers with the Confederate Army came through, cavalrymen, and their intent, one of them was local boy who had defected to the Confederacy, and they wanted that flag and stopped at her house. She and a girlfriend met them, and then she raced up the stairs before them. When they were trying to pull the flag down, she grabbed it, put it around her, and she said, if you're going to take me, you better take my flag too, or whatever, or if you want to take my flag, you better take me too. Supposedly they put a revolver to her head, and she handed it over, but she had no choice. But there was a guy named Thomas Chalmers Harbaugh who was born in Middletown but moved to Ohio. And in the late 1800s, I guess, after Whittier had made his money, I guess he figured, wow, I could write a poem about my hometown of Middletown and this Nancy Krause. And he wrote this. It was called The Valley Maid, and he wrote this lesser-known poem about Nancy Krause being this hero of the day. So there are plenty, and I know that in Sharpsburg there's these patriotic women all over the place, and maybe it is an ode to all of them. A woman named Kathleen Ernst, historian, lives up in Wisconsin now, but she wrote a great book. I wish I knew the title right off the top of my head, but I brought her in for our Heart of the Civil War documentary, and she wrote a great book about just the civilian stories of our area through the Civil War. It's a really good piece. Do you know, Rich, right off the top of your head there, what the title was? Okay, but her name Kathleen Ernst. If you look at, and she has gone on to write these fiction based on fact stories of young people during the Civil War and other historic times, and a really nice approach to these kids' books that she's written. So, yes.
Chris, early on you referred to how people
we'll have a story right about FDR driving through Frederick and
Yes, you do. So Jim was asking about another apocryphal story, one of the greatest stories attached to Barbara Fritchie, and that new Barbara Fritchie replica house that was built in the late 1920s. The story goes, it was in 1943, we're in the throes of the Second World War, and Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of England, Great Britain, is visiting FDR, President Roosevelt in Washington, D.C. The president is going to take Churchill up to Shangri-La, today's Camp David, the presidential retreat. As they are coming up the road towards Frederick County, or actually in Frederick County, they're on the outskirts of Frederick City, and Churchill sees a sign, "Welcome to Frederick, Maryland." And he all of a sudden turns to his host and says, "Frederick, Maryland? The Frederick, Maryland? Of Barbara Fritchie's home? Frederick, Maryland?" And the president and his staff are curious and start laughing. "How do you know this?" And he said, it was required reading of grade school children in Great Britain. And of course they razzed him like, "Wait a minute, you guys have the great English writers and we're just, we're still the stooges here." And he said, "It's just one of the most beautiful poems ever written. Whittier did an incredible job, and that's what we're taught in school, to emulate this great writing." So supposedly that was the story up. They didn't have time to stop, but on their return trip back to Frederick, it was early on a Sunday morning, and that's where Churchill begged and pleaded and got his way, and they pulled up early morning hours. Wasn't really anybody around there except for a couple folks on the street, but they would stop in front of the Barbara Fritchie replica house, and Churchill jumped out of the car and recited the poem from memory. And to the amazement of the president and the rest of his staff. And that's just one of the great stories. They have a plaque that commemorates that on the front of the house. And supposedly Churchill would do that again a couple years later to Truman. Supposedly they were somewhere, it was a commencement out in the Midwest. And I think Churchill said to Truman, "Do you know who Barbara Fritchie is? I can recite the poem," and he did that to him. And Eisenhower would come through too during his presidency, and we had a group of Hood College young ladies that supposedly recited the poem for Eisenhower from that second-story window. He stayed in his car. So we've had some presidents visit the Barbara Fritchie. Yeah, it probably went to Cozy after that. Any other? Yeah.
Whittier only getting one version of the history. When did Southworth stay silent from summer 63 to her death?
Yes, she did. And that was the whole thing of the one thing that I think Southworth, whatever the deal was that they had going on, it took Whittier. Whittier wouldn't even reveal who his source, he wouldn't even really give credit to Southworth. I think they kind of planned it that way. There was something up with that. But that's where I just think with Quantrell, Mary Quantrell living in Washington, D.C., being in the same town, I'm sure she probably went in person to Southworth's house, probably wanting an appointment with her and asking, but to no avail. And Southworth made several trips to Amesbury, Massachusetts, to visit. Matter of fact, she brought that Cornelius Staley Ramsburg, the descendant of Barbara's, with her on one of those trips, and they presented him with one of those canes. So it was just kind of interesting. It was neat. When I did this little mini documentary on that site I told you about on Barbara Fritchie, it was really neat also talking to the people at the museum, because the Ballad of Barbara Fritchie is one of Whittier's famous works. But still talking to some of the docents, I had to kind of fill them in on some of the things. But we were able to get a scene where I had one of the docents giving me some background on Whittier. And it was neat because I asked specifically, I said, have the docent sit at the desk where Whittier penned the poem. So it's really neat. The video shot we have of her telling the story, right behind there's Whittier's, hat and pen right on his desk. So I couldn't get Marvin to budge on the budget to send me up there to shoot it myself, so I had to hire another person to shoot it for me. Yes, Rich?
A story I heard many years ago in Frederick, and I wondered about its validity. And that is, as a fairly youngish woman, when Washington came through Frederick, that she was one of the local ladies who served General Washington. This is like 1794. Is that
We haven't been able to clarify whether that story is true. It's another one of these apocryphal stories. It's just the thought process is, okay, Washington's in town. Barbara Fritchie, she wasn't running in the high circles of town back then. I mean, she and her husband, they were glove makers. Washington's staying at a tavern there. The story goes that they didn't have, it was kind of a surprise. She was there. It was kind of some kind of knitting bee or something that was going on. All of a sudden, George Washington comes onto the scene. They want to serve George Washington tea, but they don't have anything regal. And Barbara supposedly says, oh, I've got a great tea set back at home. I'll go get it. And supposedly she served tea to George Washington out of her tea set. I don't know if it happened or not. To me, it seems a little far-fetched, and it's one of those things, just like the whole Paul Revere story. I had a fellow named George Wunderlich, and I don't know if he ever spoke to you here. George was our director of the Civil War Medical Museum in Frederick for many years. But, these things kind of take on a life of their own, these stories of embellishment. And I think it's that whole thing after the fact for people to say, oh, there was this story that Barbara did this, and that Barbara, that maybe Barbara dated Francis Scott Key for a short time, or Barbara, it's linking the history, it's linking that patriotism to even make her more patriotic. But she could have, this tavern was only a block away from her home, I guess, but then again, she didn't move to that home until later, because I've found another house of hers. And so, again, if I was really betting money, and if we've gotten a time travel capsule and went back, I would think that Barbara probably couldn't get anywhere close to George Washington. Maybe could wave from afar, but I don't know. But who knows? Maybe it did happen. But I think the one thing that I think the poem, nothing happened after. Nobody was telling this story. I went through newspapers. There was no story of Quantrell or Barbara Fritchie in the fall of 62, of the spring. If this thing was great, why didn't this happen? Why didn't this diarist write about it? And once the poem came out, now it was open season. And I think especially these Fritchie, she didn't have any kids of her own, but these grandnieces and grandnephews were kind of thinking, well, if we just kind of, and all they would really say was, Aunt Barbara was very patriotic. She would always make us wave our flags and say patriotic things or whatever. So I think they played into it. And she had one great-great-grandniece, Julia Abbott, who kind of really helped open the museum. And she had a lot of, Barbara's belongings. And when they opened in 1927-28, when they opened this replica house, supposedly she provided, this was Barbara's teapot, or this was the family Bible, and she had these things. But then, just like any kind of business arrangement, somehow egos were bruised or disagreements were had, and she said, I'm taking my Barbara Fritchie stuff and leaving. And then she opened up her own little Barbara Fritchie museum on South Market Street, not far from the entry gate to Mount Olivet. And for years, she would catch tourists coming into town on 355 Market Street coming in, and supposedly she had a little setup, and she dressed in period costume. And a lot of her collection is in the basement of Frederick's UCC United, what was that for? Yeah, okay, thank you. Church, the old German Reformed Church, as I always call it, there in Frederick, and they've got a collection of her stuff. Matter of fact, one of the most interesting things I talked to when I did these interviews, I talked to the pastor emeritus, a historian named Fred Wenner there from the church. And he actually went through a lot of those belongings and showed me and kind of talked about Barbara as a very religious individual, and that reminds me of another story. But one of the things that somebody got is when they removed Barbara, when they moved her from the German Reformed Cemetery to Mount Olivet, somebody went into her casket and took her hair comb out. She had a hair comb in and took it out, and they've got it in the collection. So a couple years ago, this woman from Minnesota came down to the library, and she said she claims to be a descendant of Barbara. And she says that Barbara had an illegitimate daughter, I kid you not, that Barbara had who ran off with a coachman who came through town just to defy Barbara. And they went up to New York, and then, whatever, descendants. So she was really serious. And then I said, well, they have this comb there. And she said, because she wanted us to dig up Barbara Fritchie. She asked, do you think you could do a DNA test? And I'm like, absolutely not, you know. And then she was like, well, maybe the comb. And I said, well, yeah, but you'll probably get, you know, all of other Fredericks past, the people who've handled that comb, probably as well. You'll get their DNA. But it's neat to see the far-reaching effects of this Barbara Fritchie poem. Unfortunately, like I said, it's I don't know if it'll stand the test of time, but it is just such a romantic tale, a great tale. And, you know, we're lucky. She did put Frederick on the map, and we're lucky to have her grave. And matter of fact, in a couple weeks, I have one of those interpretive waysides that I got some grant money from the Heart of the Civil War Heritage area, and we'll be able to tell at least a portion of that story there at her gravesite for people kind of saying, oh, what's that? Who was that lady? And, you know, to see a picture of her in her house and hear about her supposed heroism. So, yes.
When you found the article in the magazine around 1900, I think you said where someone had beat you to the punch and wrote an article about
Yeah.
Barbara Ritchie.
Barbara Fritchie, yep.
Ritchie. And the author was something like Elizabeth York Miller. What did it say on this one? Did you ever try to trace her lineage to see if she was a descendant on either side of that?
No, she was a legitimate reporter of the day who did it. There was another woman even earlier, a couple decades later, from Massachusetts who came down in the 1880s. Her name was Carolyn Dahl, and she actually interviewed people of town. She wrote a book. I got that book on eBay, and it was about Barbara Fritchie as well. And people like Dorothea Dix, famous nurse, and come into the story and all this, but it was really amazing because she kind of wrote about it, but she was the first one where she talked to eyewitnesses of Barbara being propped up at the door with a Union flag. You know, there's also stories, and apocryphal or not, General Reno, so Jesse Reno came through, supposedly said, look, boys, Spirit of 76, supposedly stopped, had tea with Barbara Fritchie, wrote his last letter home. He goes to the Battle of South Mountain. He's killed at Fox's Gap, the highest ranking Union officer, and he had a bright future. He was, you know, a superstar in that army. But he dies. They bring him back. His brother is with him, was an adjutant or assistant, comes back, supposedly on their way back into Frederick with the body. He stops at the brother stops at Barbara Fritchie's house and supposedly asks for the flag to travel back home. So there's a story that the original flag went up to Massachusetts. There's a postcard from the early 19th century or 20th century of said flag in a museum up there in Massachusetts. But then a couple decades ago, it got stolen or whatever. You know, so it's again, the story, it's very complex and complicated. It's fun, and it's really neat to just see historians go back and forth with it. I had a call back during the anniversary in 2012. I had a reporter from the Washington Post, Bob McCartney, call me up. And he said, so I understand you're like the world's authority on this Barbara Fritchie story and everything. And it was really neat to talk to him. And at the same time, I didn't want to beat on Barbara too much because I was just like, but this story, and I just think, as I told him, I said, that's why it's stories like this, and especially with the opportunity, with the internet, and to be able to research and pull all this together, it's the story behind the story, which is a real fun thing. And to really look, was it that gangs in New York thing? Was it that whole immigrant thing? Was it what the lady said there about the novel and, you know, these boys being uprated by the girls? That it's fun. It's just a fun story, and that's why, to me, it's more fun than Francis Scott Key. You know, sometimes people with Francis Scott Key can say, oh, what a great American patriot. And I keep thinking, Francis Scott Key was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Any other person who would have been caught in that predicament where he's trying to negotiate the peace, he was trying to save this doctor friend of his who got arrested, so to speak, for throwing rocks at the British when they were going in to sack Washington. You know, he negotiates his release, but they're like, not so fast, Francis Scott Key. We're not letting you take your friend away yet because we're going to bombard Baltimore. Then you can go. And that's where Francis Scott Key gets his front row seat on this ship. And I'm sure the things going through his head, oh my God, why am I here and watching what was happening to the fort? But it worked out to be the greatest thing ever. Because supposedly at the time his law business was suffering. He was seriously contemplating giving it up and becoming a preacher. He was going to do that. And I'm sure on that deck he was very scared, as anybody would be. But it worked out because he put pen to paper, and then he went back to his hotel room when he was freed because we won the day, put this beautiful song together, And then his brother-in-law said, I'm going to take that to a publisher friend of mine. And then it went like wildfire. And it's so ironic, it went like wildfire, like Whittier's poem, that our two greatest exports of Frederick, or our two greatest residents, especially on the world stage, Francis Scott Key and Barbara Fritchie, are two people who can claim their fame thanks to the American or Union flag under attack by the enemy. 50 years apart. Really great. And when I was at the Visitor Center, we made sure our exhibit, we welcomed people with Barbara Fritchie and Francis Scott Key at our front door. Right there. But I invite all of you who aren't Frederick County residents or to come to Frederick and check out that Barbara Fritchie house. Come over to Mount Olivet Cemetery. Check in with me. I'll even take you out to the grave, give you more history. But we'd love to see you up there. But again, thank you so much for having me here today. Really appreciate it.